The autumn wind howled across the desolate plains of Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and the promise of an early winter. Samuel Crawford pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse trudged through the muddy trail that barely deserved the name. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow a man whole without anyone asking questions. Samuel had been riding for 3 days straight, fleeing from something he couldn't quite name but knew was following him. The guilt ate at his insides like acid, reminding him of what he'd done back in Deadwood. The bank job had gone wrong, terribly wrong, and now innocent blood stained his hands. He'd never meant for the clerk to die, but when the gun went off in the struggle, everything changed in an instant. As darkness began to creep across the sky like spilled ink, Samuel spotted something that made his heart leap with relief. A small farmstead sat nestled in a valley below, smoke curling from its chimney like a beckoning finger. The main house was modest but well-maintained, and behind it stood a large barn that looked sturdy enough to shelter both him and his exhausted horse. The wind picked up again, and Samuel shivered. He had no choice but to seek shelter. The alternative was freezing to death on the open plains, and despite everything he'd done, he wasn't ready to meet his maker just yet. He urged his horse down the slope, noting how the windows of the farmhouse glowed with warm, inviting light. As he approached the front porch, the door opened before he could even dismount. 3 young women stepped out into the evening air, and Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. They were beautiful in that pure, untouched way that seemed impossible in this harsh land. The eldest couldn't have been more than 22, with golden hair that caught the lamplight like spun silk. The second had auburn curls that framed a face so innocent it made Samuel's chest tighten with shame. The youngest, barely 18 by his estimation, possessed dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets far beyond her years. "Evening, stranger," called the eldest, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed at odds with the wilderness surrounding them. "You look like you could use some shelter for the night." Samuel hesitated. Something about this situation felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. 3 young women alone on an isolated farm was unusual enough, but their complete lack of fear at his appearance was downright unsettling. Most frontier women would have retreated inside and barred the door at the sight of a lone rider approaching after dark. "I don't want to impose, miss," Samuel replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect his mother had drilled into him years ago. "I just need a place to rest my horse and maybe sleep in your barn, if that's acceptable." The 3 women exchanged glances that Samuel couldn't interpret. There was something in their eyes, a shared understanding that excluded him completely. The youngest stepped forward, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Nonsense," she said, her voice softer than her sister's but somehow more compelling. "You look half-frozen and completely exhausted. Come inside and warm yourself by our fire. We insist." Before Samuel could protest, the auburn-haired sister had taken his horse's reins. "I'll see to your mount," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He looks as tired as you do." The eldest woman, who had introduced herself as Mary, led Samuel into the house. The interior was surprisingly well appointed for such a remote location. Fine furniture filled the rooms, and expensive-looking paintings adorned the walls. Everything was clean and perfectly arranged, as if the women had been expecting company. "Where are my manners?" Mary laughed, a sound like silver bells in the wind. "I'm Mary Patterson, and my sisters are Sarah and Elizabeth. We've been running this farm since our father passed last spring." Samuel accepted a cup of coffee from Sarah, noting how her fingers brushed his as she handed it over. The touch sent an unexpected shiver through him, and he pulled his hand back quickly. "Samuel Crawford," he managed, though he immediately regretted giving his real name. "I'm sorry for your loss." Elizabeth settled into a chair across from him, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "Tell us about yourself, Samuel. What brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" The question hit him like a physical blow. How could he explain that he was running from the law, that he'd killed a man in cold blood, that every mile between him and Deadwood felt like borrowed time? Instead, he mumbled something about looking for work and moving west to start fresh. The sisters exchanged another one of those meaningful glances, and Samuel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something was definitely wrong here, but the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being indoors after days in the saddle made him reluctant to leave. "You must be exhausted," Mary said, rising gracefully from her chair. "Why don't you rest here tonight? We have a spare room upstairs that's been empty far too long." Samuel shook his head firmly. "I couldn't possibly. The barn will be fine for me." "Absolutely not," Elizabeth interjected, her voice carrying a note of authority that surprised him. "It's going to be a cold night, and that barn isn't heated. You'll freeze to death." Sarah returned from tending to his horse, brushing dirt from her skirts. "Besides," she added with that unsettling smile, "we rarely get visitors out here. It would be nice to have some company for once." The way she said company made Samuel's skin crawl, though he couldn't explain why. These women were offering him kindness and shelter, yet every instinct he possessed screamed danger. Perhaps it was his guilty conscience making him paranoid, or maybe it was something else entirely. "I really should stay in the barn," he insisted, standing up and moving toward the door. "I'm used to rough conditions, and I don't want to put you ladies to any trouble." But as he reached for the door handle, Elizabeth's hand shot out and grasped his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so delicate-looking, and her fingers felt ice-cold against his skin. "You will sleep with us tonight," she said, her dark eyes boring into his. The words themselves were innocent enough, but something in her tone made them sound like a threat rather than an invitation. "We insist." Samuel tried to pull his arm free, but Elizabeth's grip tightened. Mary and Sarah moved to flank him, their earlier warmth replaced by something predatory and dangerous. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Samuel could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "Let me go," he said, his voice coming out weaker than he'd intended. "I need to leave." "Oh, but you can't leave now," Mary whispered, her breath cold against his ear. "Not when we've been waiting so long for someone like you." Samuel's blood turned to ice in his veins. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking together in his mind, forming a picture so horrifying he almost couldn't accept it. The isolated location, the 3 beautiful women living alone, the expensive furnishings that seemed out of place, and most telling of all, their complete lack of fear when he'd arrived. "What are you?" he breathed, though part of him already knew the answer. Sarah laughed, a sound that no longer seemed musical but rather like the cry of some nocturnal predator. "We're exactly what we appear to be, Samuel. 3 lonely women living on the frontier, trying to survive in a harsh world. But you're not the first traveler to seek shelter here," Elizabeth added, her grip on his wrist growing painfully tight. "And you won't be the last." Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. How many other men had stopped at this farmstead, drawn by the promise of warmth and shelter, only to disappear forever? How long had these 3 women been luring victims to their isolated trap? "The expensive furniture," he said aloud, the pieces falling into place. "The paintings, the fine clothes, they belonged to other travelers, didn't they?" Mary smiled, and for the first time, Samuel saw the predator lurking behind her beautiful facade. "You're quite perceptive, Samuel." "Yes, our guests have been very generous over the years. It's amazing what people will carry with them when they're fleeing from something." The last comment hit him like a sledgehammer. They knew. Somehow, these women knew exactly what he was running from, knew about the blood on his hands and the guilt eating away at his soul. "How?" he whispered. "We can smell it on you," Sarah said, inhaling deeply as if savoring a fine wine. "The guilt, the fear, the desperation. It draws us like moths to a flame." Elizabeth finally released his wrist, but Samuel found he couldn't move toward the door. His legs felt like lead, and his vision began to blur around the edges. The coffee, he realized with growing horror. They drugged the coffee. "Don't fight it," Elizabeth crooned, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "It will be over soon, and then you can rest. No more running, no more guilt, no more pain." Samuel's knees buckled, and he found himself sinking toward the floor. Through his fading vision, he watched the three sisters circle him like vultures around Carrion. Their beautiful faces had changed, becoming sharp and predatory, with eyes that gleamed with an inhuman hunger. "What are you going to do to me?" he managed to gasp out. "The same thing we've done to all the others," Mary replied matter-of-factly. "You'll sleep with us tonight, Samuel Crawford. Forever." As consciousness slipped away, Samuel's last coherent thought was a prayer for forgiveness, not just for his recent sins, but for all the pain he'd caused throughout his life. Perhaps this was justice after all. Perhaps this was exactly what he deserved. When Samuel awoke, he found himself lying in what appeared to be the barn he'd originally wanted to sleep in. Pale morning light filtered through the gaps in the wooden walls, and he could hear birds chirping outside. For a moment, he wondered if the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and guilt. But as he sat up, the memories came flooding back with crystal clarity. The three sisters, their strange behavior, the drugged coffee, and their final, terrifying transformation. He looked down at himself, expecting to find wounds or some other evidence of what they'd done to him, but he appeared to be completely unharmed. Samuel struggled to his feet, his body feeling strangely light and disconnected. He stumbled toward the barn door, desperate to escape this place before the sisters discovered he was awake. But as he reached for the wooden latch, his hand passed straight through it. He stared at his hand in confusion, then tried again with the same result. Panic began to rise in his chest as he looked down at his body. He was translucent like morning mist, and growing more so by the second. "No," he whispered, the word coming out as barely a breath. "No, this can't be happening." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The sisters hadn't killed him in the traditional sense. They'd done something far worse. They'd trapped his soul in this place, bound him to their twisted game for eternity. A soft laugh echoed through the barn, and Samuel spun around to see Elizabeth standing in the doorway. In the morning light, she looked exactly as she had the night before, beautiful, innocent, and utterly terrifying. "Good morning, Samuel," she said pleasantly. "I trust you slept well? What have you done to me?" he demanded, though his voice sounded hollow and distant even to his own ears. "We've given you exactly what you asked for," she replied with that same predatory smile. "Rest from your troubles, an end to your running. You're free now, Samuel. Free from guilt, free from pain, free from the burden of living." Samuel tried to rush toward her, to grab her and demand answers, but his feet wouldn't carry him past the threshold of the barn. He was trapped here, unable to leave, unable to touch anything in the physical world. "How many others?" he asked, the question coming out as a broken whisper. Elizabeth's smile widened. "You're the 47th, she said with obvious pride. Each one thought they were so clever, so sure they could outwit three helpless women. But guilt makes men predictable, Samuel. It makes them easy to catch." As she spoke, Samuel became aware of other presences in the barn. Ghostly figures began to materialize around him, the spirits of other travelers who had made the same fatal mistake he had. They were all men, all bearing the weight of terrible deeds, all trapped in this cursed place for eternity. "Welcome to our family," Elizabeth said, turning to leave. "Don't worry, you'll have plenty of company. We're always looking for new additions." Samuel watched her go, understanding finally dawning on him. This wasn't random murder or robbery. This was something far more sinister. The three sisters were collectors, gathering the souls of guilty men and binding them to this place. But why? What was their ultimate purpose? Over the following days, Samuel learned the truth from his fellow prisoners. The sisters weren't entirely human, they were something older, something that fed on guilt and suffering. They'd been operating this trap for over 50 years, luring desperate men to their doom and adding their souls to their collection. But the most horrifying revelation came from one of the older spirits, a man named Jonas who claimed to have been trapped here for over a decade. According to him, the sisters were building an army. Every soul they collected made them stronger, and they were preparing for something big, something that would require the combined spiritual energy of dozens of trapped souls. "They're planning to open a gateway," Jonas whispered during one of their ghostly conversations. "A doorway between our world and theirs. Once they have enough power, they'll bring their kind through, and this frontier will become a hunting ground like nothing the world has ever seen." Samuel felt what remained of his soul recoil in horror. If Jonas was right, then their individual fates were insignificant compared to what was coming. The sisters weren't just killers, they were advanced scouts for an invasion that would consume everything in its path. But knowing the truth and being able to act on it were two different things. The spirits were powerless, unable to affect the physical world or warn potential victims. They could only watch as more travelers arrived, drawn by the same false promise of shelter that had doomed them all. The worst part was the waiting. Each night, Samuel and the other spirits were forced to watch as the sisters performed their twisted ritual, draining away pieces of their spiritual essence to fuel their dark purpose. With each passing day, the ghosts grew weaker, more translucent, until eventually they would fade away entirely. Samuel realized he had perhaps months, maybe weeks, before he was completely consumed. The irony wasn't lost on him that his punishment for taking one life was to potentially enable the taking of thousands more. His guilt over the bank clerk's death seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what his trapped soul was helping to accomplish. It was during his third week of captivity that Samuel noticed something different. A new traveler had arrived, but unlike the previous victims, this one radiated an entirely different kind of energy. He was young, maybe 25, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. But there was no guilt emanating from him, no desperate flight from past sins. The sisters seemed confused by their new visitor. Samuel watched from the barn as they attempted their usual seduction, but their powers seemed to have no effect on him. The young man introduced himself as Thomas Whitehorse and claimed to be a traveling preacher making his way to California. "I appreciate your hospitality, ladies," Thomas said politely as they offered him food and shelter. "But I make it a practice never to impose on folks for more than one night. I'll be happy to sleep in your barn and continue on my way in the morning." Samuel felt a spark of hope for the first time since his capture. This Thomas was different somehow, protected in a way that their previous victims hadn't been. Maybe, just maybe, he could escape the sisters' trap and warn others about what was happening here. But as the evening progressed, Samuel's hope began to fade. The sisters weren't giving up on their new victim, they were simply changing tactics. Instead of their usual seductive approach, they began telling Thomas about the dangerous men who'd been spotted in the area, bandits and killers who preyed on lone travelers. "We've heard such terrible stories," Mary said with false concern in her voice. "Just last month, a family was murdered not 10 miles from here. The authorities think it was the work of the Crawford gang." Samuel's ghostly form recoiled at the mention of his name. The sisters were using his crime to frighten their new victim into staying, turning his guilt into another weapon in their arsenal. Thomas listened politely to their warnings, but showed no sign of changing his plans. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but the Lord watches over those who travel in his service. I'm not afraid of bandits or killers." Elizabeth leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on the young preacher's face. "Perhaps you should be," she whispered. "There are worse things than bandits roaming these plains. Things that hunger for more than just money or possessions." For the first time since his arrival, Thomas seemed to sense something was wrong. Samuel saw his hand move instinctively toward something hidden beneath his coat, and his eyes began to scan the room more carefully. "What kind of things?" Thomas asked quietly. Sarah smiled, and Samuel saw her teeth had grown noticeably sharper. "The kind that feed on souls, preacher man. The kind that collect the guilty and the damned." Thomas's hand closed around whatever he'd been reaching for, and Samuel was amazed to see it was a simple wooden cross. But as the preacher's fingers touched the carved wood, the entire room seemed to fill with a warm, golden light that made the sisters hiss and recoil. "I see," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength and authority. "You're not human at all, are you?" The pretense finally dropped completely. The three sisters transformed before Samuel's eyes, their beautiful faces becoming gaunt and predatory, their elegant dresses shifting into tattered funeral shrouds. Their eyes glowed with an unholy fire, and their fingers had grown into razor-sharp claws. "Clever little preacher," Elizabeth snarled, her voice now carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. "But your faith won't save you from us. We've consumed men of God before." Thomas stood up slowly, the cross in his hand growing brighter with each passing second. "Perhaps," he said calmly, "but I'm not here by accident. I came looking for you." The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. This wasn't a random encounter. Thomas had known exactly what he was walking into. But how, and more importantly, why? "The territorial governor received reports about missing travelers," Thomas continued, never taking his eyes off the three creatures. "Always the same pattern, men with guilty consciences disappearing near this location. He sent me to investigate." Mary laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You? One man with a wooden cross and misplaced faith?" "Not just me," Thomas replied with a slight smile. He pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time. "Right about now, a company of cavalry should be surrounding this farmstead. And they're armed with more than crosses." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses' hooves thundered outside. Shouts filled the night air, and the golden light from Thomas's cross grew even brighter. Samuel could see other spirits materializing around him, all of them watching the confrontation with desperate hope. The sisters realized they'd walked into a trap, but it was too late to escape. The cavalry had indeed surrounded the farmstead, and Samuel could see through the windows that they carried torches and what looked like rifles loaded with silver ammunition. "You think your soldiers can stop us?" Sarah shrieked, her form becoming more monstrous by the second. "We've been here for 50 years. This is our domain." "Your domain is ending tonight," Thomas said firmly. He began to recite something in Latin, words that seemed to burn the air around them and made the sisters writhe in agony. But the creatures weren't going down without a fight. Elizabeth lunged toward Thomas, her claws aimed at his throat, but she struck something invisible in midair and was thrown backward across the room. The protective barrier around the preacher was stronger than anything the sisters had encountered before. Outside, the cavalry opened fire, but instead of regular bullets, Samuel realized they were shooting blessed silver rounds that exploded in bursts of that same golden light. Each impact made the farmstead shake and caused the sisters to scream in pain. "The gateway!" Elizabeth shouted to her sisters. "We have to complete the ritual. If we can open the gateway, our brethren will come through and destroy them all." Mary and Sarah nodded, their forms beginning to blur and shift as they prepared to channel the spiritual energy they'd been collecting. Samuel felt a terrible pulling sensation as his essence was drawn toward them, along with that of every other trapped soul. This was it, the moment they'd all been dreading. The sisters were about to drain all of their captured spirits at once, using their combined power to tear open a hole between dimensions. If they succeeded, an army of creatures like them would pour through, and the frontier would become a nightmare beyond imagination. But Thomas wasn't finished. As the sisters began their ritual, he raised his cross high above his head and spoke a single word in a language that predated human civilization. The golden light exploded outward, filling every corner of the farmstead and causing the sisters to stagger backward. "The bonds are broken," Thomas shouted over the chaos. "You are free. Help me send these demons back to where they came from." Samuel felt the invisible chains that had held him to the barn suddenly snap. For the first time in weeks, he could move freely, and he could feel his spiritual strength returning as the sisters' hold over him weakened. Around him, dozens of other ghosts were experiencing the same liberation. But freedom wasn't enough. They had to act quickly before the sisters could complete their ritual. Samuel reached out with his restored power, focusing all of his energy on disrupting the dark magic that was building around the three creatures. The other spirits joined him, and suddenly the farmstead was filled with the combined will of 50 trapped souls, all focused on a single purpose. The sisters' ritual began to collapse under the spiritual assault, their carefully constructed magic unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart. Elizabeth shrieked in fury and desperation. "You cannot stop us. We are eternal. We are." Her words were cut off as Thomas completed his own ritual. The golden light reached a crescendo, and Samuel watched in amazement as the three sisters were pulled backward into what looked like a tear in the air itself. They fought against the suction, clawing at the floor and screaming curses in languages that hurt to hear, but it was no use. One by one, they were dragged through the dimensional rift and back to whatever hellish realm had spawned them. The last thing Samuel saw was Elizabeth's face, twisted with rage and hatred, before she disappeared forever into the swirling darkness. The rift collapsed with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the farmstead was filled with blessed silence. The golden light began to fade, leaving only the warm glow of the cavalry's torches outside. Thomas lowered his cross and sagged against the wall, clearly exhausted by what he'd just accomplished. Around him, the liberated spirits began to gather, their forms growing brighter and more solid as they were freed from the sisters' influence. "Is it over?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying more clearly than it had in weeks. Thomas nodded wearily. "It's over. The gateway is sealed, and those creatures can never return to this realm." One by one, the spirits began to fade away, finally able to find peace after their long imprisonment. Some waved goodbye, others simply smiled with relief, but all of them carried a sense of gratitude as they moved on to whatever waited beyond. Samuel was among the last to go. He looked at Thomas, this unlikely hero who had risked everything to save people he'd never met, and felt compelled to speak. "Thank you," he said simply. "For all of us." Thomas smiled sadly. "I only wish I could have arrived sooner, before you all had to suffer." "The suffering was deserved," Samuel replied. "We all came here carrying guilt, running from things we'd done. Maybe this was justice after all." "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "But everyone deserves a chance at redemption," Samuel Crawford. "Even those who think they're beyond saving." Samuel felt a warmth spreading through his spiritual form, a peace he hadn't known since childhood. The guilt that had driven him to this place was still there, but it no longer felt like a crushing weight. Instead, it felt like a lesson learned, a burden that had finally served its purpose. "Tell people about this place," Samuel said as he began to fade. "Make sure no one else falls into this kind of trap." "I will," Thomas promised. "The territorial government will post warnings, and the cavalry will patrol this area regularly." Samuel nodded his thanks and felt himself letting go at last. The farmstead dissolved around him, replaced by a warm, golden light that welcomed him home. For the first time in his life or death, he was truly at peace. Thomas watched until the last spirit had departed, then walked outside to meet the cavalry commander. The farmstead would be burned to the ground, its evil legacy finally ended. The weapons and possessions that had belonged to the victims would be returned to their families where possible, and a proper grave marker would be erected to honor those who had died here. As the sun rose over the Wyoming plains, Thomas mounted his horse and rode away from the smoldering ruins. He had other territories to patrol, other supernatural threats to investigate. The frontier was still a dangerous place, but at least this particular nightmare was over. Behind him, the wind scattered the ashes of the cursed farmstead across the plains, carrying with it the memory of 47 souls who had finally found their rest. The barn where they had been imprisoned was nothing but charred wood now, and the evil that had dwelt there was gone forever. The territory would remember this place, but not as a site of horror. Instead, it would be remembered as proof that even in the darkest corners of the wilderness, redemption was possible, and that no evil, no matter how ancient or powerful, could stand against the combined force of faith, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Samuel Crawford and his fellow spirits were free at last, their long nightmare finally over.